All right, well, I want to thank Pastor Bowler so much for having me here. It's a privilege to be here again. If you don't know, I'm him, so it's good to be here. I just want to start off by saying I am the husband to one fantabulous wife. She's joining me here today. I'm the father of 3 amazing kids, and I'm also the survivor of 8 heart surgeries. What I'd like to do this morning is just share a few brief words. If you'll let me, I'd like to read a short excerpt from my book. And I'd also like to do a few questions and answers. So as I'm speaking this morning, if anything pops in your head that you'd like to ask me, you can feel free to ask me. My background is in marketing and graphic design. And there's an adage in marketing that says, show, don't tell. So I've prepared just a very brief video that really shows my story, gives a very brief overview of what my story is and why I decided to write a book. So we can go ahead and play that now.
Why is this happening to me? Maybe that's a question you've asked yourself. If you have, you're not alone. I've had 8 heart operations, 4 of which were open heart surgeries. I've nearly died on the operating table 3 times. I fought my way back and came out stronger. Told I would never physically excel, I defied the odds and earned a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I've written a memoir chronicling my incredible journey. My story is one of faith, healing, and above all, hope. My book is a challenge for us to turn our wounds into scars. Because a scar says, I've been healed, and this is my story.
All right, you've seen the video, we can go home now. All done. I'm thankful that God sees the entire puzzle. When we go through difficult things in life, we sometimes only see a small puzzle piece of what we're facing. But we can rest assured that God sees the entire puzzle, He knows the entire picture, and He knows the entire plan. So as a quick summary, I've had surgeries at 11 months, 18 months old. I've had surgeries at 8 years old, 12, 13, 14, and then again at 40 years old. Like the video said, I've nearly died on the operating table 3 times. I was actually diagnosed with what they call supramitral stenosis and subaortic stenosis. My open heart journey, as I've come to call it, really began in 1978. That was my first open heart surgery, where I was given a 20% chance to live. I don't remember this surgery. My parents do, my family does, and I won't spoil it, but I did make it through the surgery. My second major open heart surgery was when I was 8 years old, and this surgery I remember. This was the first operation that I actually remember, and for me it was like the first surgery. I had a few more smaller operations than that, and my next major open heart surgery was at 14 years old. And this surgery was kind of unique because I had a mechanical valve put in my heart. And that valve ticks like a watch. And if it's quiet enough in here, you can actually hear it. My last open heart surgery came as a shock, came as a surprise. Surgeries were something I had as a kid, but a few short years ago, as a 40-year-old man, I had my 4th open heart surgery. And I will just say this, I had a burst aortic aneurysm. and I absolutely should not be standing here today talking to you. It is a miracle from God that I am here, and but for the grace of God, and but for the power of prayer, I am privileged to be able to stand here and share my story with you. Before I go too far along, I want to pause, and I'm going to mention 4 things. And I want you to keep these 4 things in the back of your mind. I promise I'm going to come back to them. But the 4 things I want to mention are this: living room, waiting room, operating room, recovery room. Living room, waiting room, operating room, recovery room. Now, I don't know how many of you remember, but I actually spoke here 4 years ago, almost to the day. February 2012, I was here. And at the time, I asked a question. What I had to say was based around, what could I possibly say to you? And the reason I said that, most of you are old enough to be my parents. Some of you are old enough to be my great-grandparents. But today, I come to you as an author. And the seeds of the book really started in the fall of 2020. Sadly, it started with tragedy. There was a friend of mine, his wife, he and his wife lost a child. It was a stillborn birth. And he was an artist and he wanted to write a children's book, kind of to work through what he'd been through. And he asked if I would join him for a walk. So we went to a forest and we walked for over 2 hours. And he would share ideas, and I mostly listened. I'd give some feedback. And over the course of our walk, I continued to talk, and I gave him ideas for his book. And then he turned to me and he said, "Would you ever write a book?" And the question kind of caught me off guard. For one, I thought, I'm too young. And what could I possibly have to say? And I can't write. And what if I'm criticized? And most importantly, do I have anything worth saying? Well, I'm standing here today to tell you I've got something to say. And that's why I wrote. My book, Scar Tissue, really wrestles with the idea of survivor's guilt and having a surviving hope in the face of adversity. Survivor's guilt is actually something that I've faced multiple times over the course of my life. And so I wrote about it. And as I wrote, I spent about a year writing, spent about a year editing and looking for a publisher and an agent. But I had different working titles for my book. None of them felt right. I knew I'd found the right title when I stumbled across this fun little fact. I'm going to read it for you. Because scar tissue is made up of fibers, not skin cells, it is stronger than ordinary skin. And unlike skin, it does not have hair, sweat glands, or blood vessels. Scar tissue is stronger than ordinary skin. Scar tissue is a healed wound. It's pain and trauma written on the body that says, I've been healed, and this is my story. If I were to ask any of you here, do you have a scar? There's a story behind that scar. Every scar on a body tells a story. And so in my book, scar tissue is not just physical scar tissue. Scar tissue is an attitude. It's a concept. It's a view that says, I am not a victim, I am a victor. And as I was writing, I couldn't help but think about our ultimate example, Jesus' story of overcoming sin and death on the cross and becoming part of humanity's survival guide. That is scar tissue. Now, how many of you remember those rooms I talked about? Okay, what were they? Living room? Oh, good, you were listening. What are those rooms? Living room, waiting room, operating room, recovery room. That's life. Those rooms are life. At some point in your life, you are in one of those rooms or will be in one of those rooms. What's the living room? The living room is where we live life. We're unsuspecting of trials. Everything seems to be going along well. Our job is good. Family life is good. Our relationships are good. What do you do in the living room? You look up and you say, God, thank you. Be grateful for the good times. Thank God for them. And if I could characterize the living room in one word, it would be this: gratitude. Our family lived in that living room for a long time. Then something happened with my health back in 1977. And my parents' lives were thrown into chaos, and there was uncertainty ahead. And we quickly moved from the living room to the waiting room. And the waiting room is where you know there's trials ahead, but you don't have a clear picture. You don't know what you're facing. And often this room can be characterized by anxiety, worry, and fear, because you don't see the future. You don't know what you're dealing with. In our own life, my parents saw 11 different cardiologists because they knew something was wrong with me, but they didn't know what. And I continued to have episodes of fainting and being rushed to the hospital multiple times. My parents tried to figure out what was going on. That was the waiting room. And if I could use one word to characterize the waiting room, it's this: trust. Trust the Lord that He has a plan. And what do you do in the waiting room? Slow down. Life is not humming along as normal. Slow down. Wait on God's timing. Trust in His presence, purpose in the unknown. It's trust. We eventually got a diagnosis for what my problem was, and it became clear that I was in crisis. And so that next room that we went into was the operating room. In the operating room of life, this is the storm. This is the crisis. This is where you are facing your trial head on, and it is bad. It's a difficult room to be in. It's not a pleasant room to be in. But know that God is with you in the worst that you face in life. In the absolute darkest hours, God is right there with you. Know that time spent in the operating room will not last forever. Some of my surgeries have ranged from 2 hours to 8 hours to 11 hours. They're all different, but at some point, the surgery comes to an end. And if I could characterize life in the operating room when you're in crisis, if I could summarize that with one word, it's presence. God's presence. Know that God is with you in the hardest times of life. My parents met Ray and Melody Flint and David and Robin Bowler in a time of crisis for them. In 1978, they came to pray with my parents and to be a blessing for them in a time of crisis. And what do I know? I know that you will need help in crisis. I needed help in crisis. What do I also know? Others will need your help. Be there for them. The good thing about an operation is that they end. And every surgery I've been in, they've finished operating, and they've wheeled me into the recovery room. What is the recovery room? The storm is over in the recovery room. You're recovering from what's just happened. Maybe you have no idea what's just happened. Maybe it's completely caught you off guard. And now you're recovering and trying to figure out what just happened. There are things to learn in the recovery room. I will say this, life does not go back to normal. There are new habits, new normals that come as a result of being through an operation. If I could characterize the recovery room in one word, it's growth. Because you've just gone through these three different rooms, and now you're recovering and there's new things to learn. The Bowlers and the Foots have become lifelong friends to my parents, George and Kay, and our family because of a crisis. I am only here, standing here today, talking to you because your pastor helped a family in need 46 years ago. That's the only reason I'm here today. They intervened. They were there for my parents. That formed a lifelong friendship, which continues to. We will be in one of those rooms. The living room, be grateful. The waiting room, trust. The operating room, God's presence. And the recovery room is growth. What are my lessons learned from surgery? People have asked me, what has this taught you? And there are a number of things that I've learned from having open heart surgeries and having many of them. I'm in my recovery room today. My surgeries are done and over. I've recovered. So what have I learned? Number one, do not quit. In whatever you're facing, don't quit. If you're tempted to give up, if you're tempted to say, God, I can't take this anymore, continue. Refuse to see yourself as a victim. All of us have been victimized. All of us feel like we've been treated unfairly at different points in life. And that's fine. But don't see yourself as a victim. This is the hard truth that I've learned. Suffering is a human. Absolutely every single one of us, to varying degrees, in different ways, will have to endure suffering. It may be emotional, it may be financial, relational, but in different areas, we are called to suffer. And for me, I've always held on to the belief that God has purpose in my suffering. There is a reason why we go through the things that we go through. And I've often thought, if I faced every one of my surgeries thinking there's no reason for this, I'm a victim, this shouldn't have happened to me, what kind of a husband would I be? What kind of a father would I be? What kind of a friend would I be? But when I see God's hand in the hardest times of life, that changes how I respond to the people around me. That changes how I look at everything. And I want to stop here for a moment. Probably the hardest lesson that I've had to learn is that you will never get a satisfactory answer to the why me question. When we go through hard things, it's the first question that we ask. God, why is this happening to me? We may never know. As a human, we ask, but we'll never know. I don't know why I've had 8 heart. I don't know why my parents have been called to face difficult things, why my family have been called to face difficult things. I don't know. And I probably will never know. But I have learned something better than asking why, is to shift my focus from asking why to asking what. God, what are you trying to teach me? When I ask the what question, suddenly I get a whole bunch of answers. Why did I go through this? I don't know. What can I learn from this? Man, there's all kinds of things that I'm learning, still learning. Assume that there's a lesson to be learned, and you can be grateful for what you have. You will see that there's something that hardship can teach you. And interestingly enough, when you assume there's a reason and there's lessons to be learned, there's a story that emerges. It's a story that I see from page 1 of the Bible to the end of Revelation. It's a story of God's faithfulness, his desire to redeem mankind. There's a story for the enduring things that we go through. So I wrote my story, and I asked myself, why is it important to suffer well? Why should we go through things assuming there's a purpose, assuming there's lessons to be learned? Why is it important to go through these things? And the answer hit me when I read this quote. And candidly, when I read this quote, I cried. Because this really summarized why we go through hard things. I'll read it for you. The quote is this. You will tell your story of how you've overcome what you're going through now, and it will become part of someone else's survival guide. One day, you will tell your story of how you've overcome what you're going through now, and it will become part of someone else's survival guide. Suffer well to help others, to encourage others. Is that not what Jesus did on the cross? So my desire is for my story to help others because I've been helped by those who have shared their story. There's a passage I want to read. Many of you will know it. It has become my life passage. And when I was younger, I used to hear people talk about, I have a life verse. And I thought, I don't have a life verse. How do you want those? I've got my life passage now. And it is this. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So think about those rooms. We're in one, we'll be in one. Look for the lessons that are there to be learned. Because what that enables you to do is when you're in the living room, thank you, God. When you're in the waiting room, God, I can't see the future, but I'm trusting your plan. When you're in the operating room, you know he is with you. His presence is there. And when you're in the recovery room, God, you are going to use this to grow me in an incredible way. I've seen that play out multiple times in my life. And I'm thankful that I can know I serve a God who has a reason for what we endure and what we are going through. If it's okay with you, I'd like to read a short excerpt from my book. This is from chapter 3, entitled, It Didn't Begin as My Story. All that I am, or hope to be, I owe to my mother, Abraham Lincoln. April 1st, 1978. Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff. The captain's matter-of-fact voice broke over the intercom. The Air Canada flight, now cleared for takeoff, was the first aircraft out on that sunny yet chilly spring morning. Passengers packed the plane with chatter and bustling activity. For most, the day promised an opportunity to reunite with loved ones, visit new places and play wide-eyed tourists, or conduct long-distance business. For George and Kay Covey, this was a literal race against time, a desperate journey that would forever change their lives. Kay clutching her year-and-a-half-old ragdoll son, whose complexion was a ghastly gray-white color, and whose short breaths had increasingly become shallower. As the plane's wheels lifted off the ground and the aircraft ascended heavenward, Kay did not dare to look at the clouds beneath. She simply hoped and prayed that her horrible sick boy to Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, Ontario. I cannot imagine how that flight felt for my parents. My mom recounts how she held me up to the plane's air vents so the cool hissing air could pass over my little face, allowing me to breathe better. As a parent, I cannot imagine holding one of my own children in my arms, not knowing if the agonizing hours ahead would see him die or if pleading prayers for life would be answered. When the plane finally arrived at Toronto Pearson International Airport, an ambulance awaited parents on the tarmac, ready to rush me to Sick Kids. After flying halfway across the country, I was immediately admitted, and the doctors told my parents it was unlikely I would survive. It seemed a desperate journey had ended in a hopeless arrival. Dark clouds ahead. To properly tell my story, I must not begin where it began for me, but for how it started for my parents. And if you want to hear more, you'll have to buy the book.